Many Russians no longer appear willing to remain in Crimea. A wave of departures from the peninsula has already started. After a series of strikes carried out between June 19th and June 21st, residents rushed to gather their belongings and prepare to leave. One recent example captured the atmosphere. Russian citizens crowded railway stations while attempting to get out of Crimea. Some openly questioned why they were still there. At the stations, voices could be heard saying they wanted to return to Moscow. The situation intensified after the Kerch Bridge was once again closed to traffic for several hours following the latest attacks. 4 S-400 radar installations assigned to protect the bridge, along with 2 Pantsir air defense systems, were reportedly hit. The strike may have sharply reduced the remaining safe operating window for Crimea's most important transportation route. Afterward, civilians were forced to wait as long as 9 hours before traffic resumed. More than 700 vehicles formed long lines as travelers attempted to move from Crimea toward mainland Russia in the direction of Krasnodar. Reports indicated that waits at manual inspection checkpoints exceeded 2 hours. Many Russians were willing to spend hours on the road simply to leave Crimea and reach Krasnodar. Ferry operations were also disrupted. During this period, 3 maritime vessels, including the Panagia ferry, were reportedly attacked. These ferries were among the ships transporting military cargo to Crimea, including missiles and launch containers for S-300 and S-400 air defense systems. As a result, sea routes leading away from the peninsula were also restricted. Yet even as available exits became fewer, many Russians showed little desire to stay. Recent events convinced them that Crimea was becoming increasingly vulnerable. In recent days, the conflict has spread deeper into the peninsula. Energy facilities, fuel storage locations, and gas infrastructure have suffered repeated attacks. Darkness has begun spreading across parts of Crimea. Fuel supplies are becoming strained, and connections with mainland Russia are growing weaker. During 3 consecutive nights, that isolation reached a new level. The campaign began on June 19th with strikes aimed deep inside Crimea's energy system. The Halibki underground natural gas storage facility on the Tarkhanket Peninsula was targeted. This site plays a critical role in maintaining pressure across the gas network and balancing seasonal demand. Damage to the facility weakened the peninsula's gas transportation capacity. 4 gas compressor stations were then struck across Crimea. Their loss reduced pressure throughout the network. Without these stations, gas cannot be effectively delivered to consumers. A locomotive in Rozdolne was disabled, disrupting railway resupply operations within the peninsula. The Rapanic coastal surveillance radar station in Kamyanska was also destroyed, creating another gap in Russian maritime and aerial monitoring around Crimea. The first night focused on infrastructure that was rarely visible but essential for daily operations. The impact was significant despite the limited public attention. The second night shifted toward larger and more visible targets. At approximately 11 p.m. on June 20th, witnesses reported hearing drones overhead. Soon afterward, Russian air defense fire broke the silence. Minutes later, a powerful explosion was reported in Simferopol. The target was the Tavrida thermal power plant, a facility capable of generating 470 megawatt, and commissioned by Russia in 2019 to strengthen Crimea's energy independence. NASA firm's satellite monitoring detected thermal signatures consistent with a fire at the site. Thick black smoke rose above Strohanivka. Over the following 2 hours, explosions were reported throughout the peninsula. Residents from Simferopol to Sevastopol described hearing blasts and smelling smoke. The Jurevlivka gas distribution station near Surapel was struck. The facility is connected to the Jankoy-Simferopol pipeline and supplies gas to nearby communities. The test fuel and liquefied gas storage terminal was also hit and subsequently caught fire. Another target was the highway bridge crossing the Henichesk Strait. This bridge serves as a key route for moving personnel and materials between Crimea and Russian forces operating in southern Ukraine. The strike disrupted that southern logistics connection. Unlike the previous night, the second wave focused on prominent facilities. Soon afterward, power outages began appearing across parts of the peninsula. The third night delivered the most extensive attack. During the night of June 21st, swarms of Ukrainian drones were directed toward Crimea. This time, the primary objective was Kerch, the center of the peninsula's fuel logistics network. The Tees terminal, one petroleum products and liquefied gas terminal at Kerch port, was struck. Fuel tanks believed to be fully loaded caught fire, producing a massive blaze. The industrial zone of Kerch Maritime Port also came under attack. Positions belonging to the 630th Railway Battalion of the 39th Railway Brigade were reportedly hit. Several S-400 radar components and Pantsir systems, including the air defense installation at Kortnoy, were destroyed. What made the operation particularly notable was its simultaneous nature. At the same time, Kavkaz Port on the Russian side of the bridge was targeted. Located in the Krasnodar region, this port had been providing alternative ferry-based supply routes whenever movement across the Crimea bridge faced restrictions. As limitations affected bridge traffic, strikes hit fuel infrastructure on both sides of the crossing. A drone attack was also launched against the Panagia ferry, leading to the suspension of ferry services. At least 10 additional explosions were reportedly heard overnight from the direction of the Sea of Azov near Kerch. Traffic across the Crimea bridge remained halted for several hours. When the results of all 3 nights were combined, the scale of the operation became clear. Zelensky stated that the strikes hit targets approximately 300 kilometers from the front line. He described them as long-range sanctions and added that Russia understands only power, while Ukraine's long-range capabilities serve peace. According to his statement, the effects of those strikes are being felt by Russian soldiers and civilians throughout Crimea. Roughly 60,000 Russian troops are stationed in Crimea, and this force relies heavily on supplies arriving from outside the peninsula. Modern armies cannot operate without fuel. Without it, tanks and armored vehicles remain stationary. Artillery units lose the ability to reposition. Supply trucks cannot move ammunition to where it is needed. Fuel is not only required for transportation. Military facilities throughout Crimea depend on diesel-powered generators. Every base, headquarters, and radar installation requires electricity to function. The radar systems of the S-400 network need continuous power. Once power is interrupted, air defense loses visibility. Communication systems, drone operation centers, and intelligence monitoring networks also depend entirely on electricity. After 3 nights of strikes, major fuel supply routes were disrupted. Diesel needed to keep generators running became increasingly difficult to obtain. The result was a combined operational challenge. Vehicles faced restrictions. Radar coverage came under pressure. Command and control capabilities weakened. The destruction of 4 S-400 radar systems and 2 Pantsir air defense units created significant openings in Crimea's defensive network. This generated a cycle that became increasingly difficult to break. As protection declined, future attacks became easier to conduct. The situation involving the Black Sea Fleet also became increasingly serious. The Atesh resistance movement reported that fleet leadership had prepared plans to relocate from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk. Magyar openly identified this objective. According to the plan, conditions would be created that make continued deployment in Crimea increasingly difficult for Russian military personnel. Ukraine's defense ministry formally incorporated this approach into what it described as a logistics lockdown program. An additional $115 million was allocated to expand medium-range strike capabilities. Military pressure soon spilled into civilian life. The peninsula entered what was described as its most severe fuel shortage since the 2014 annexation. In late May, authorities introduced a weekly gasoline coupon program allowing purchases of 20 liter. The coupons disappeared almost immediately after publication on official Telegram channels. Drivers then spent hours waiting in lines. Following the 3 nights of attacks, Aksionov ordered a complete halt to fuel sales at 9 a.m. on June 21st. The suspension covered cash transactions, electronic transfers, and coupon purchases. It applied to both private citizens and legal entities. Remaining supplies were reserved exclusively for public services and security organizations. On the black market, gasoline prices climbed to 4 times their normal level. Authorities established an emergency hotline for tourists who had become stranded. Kremlin spokesman Peskov acknowledged the crisis with unusual directness and stated that countermeasures were being implemented. At the same time, military bloggers sharply criticized the armed forces. According to their assessments, the attacks were not anticipated, and the response arrived too slowly. The energy problem extended beyond fuel supplies. After the strike on the Tavrida thermal power plant, electricity disruptions began affecting northwestern Crimea, central districts, and coastal areas in the south. Rolling blackouts were introduced in Sevastopol. Officials urgently activated the 129-megawatt mobile gas turbine facility in the Balaklava district. Even so, its output proved insufficient. A power failure in Jankoy also disrupted water distribution. Residents began receiving water service only during 2-hour intervals. Electrical outages were likewise reported in Armyansk, Alushta, and Krasnoperkopsk. All of this unfolded during temperatures reaching 30 degrees. An advisor connected to occupation authorities urged residents to switch off air conditioners and avoid using unnecessary electrical devices. Transportation networks also suffered major disruption. Ferry operations were suspended. Truck operators were forced onto a much longer land route through Rostov, Taganrog, Mariupol, and Melitopol before reaching Crimea. That route stretches hundreds of kilometers beyond the normal journey. However, this corridor also falls within the range of Ukrainian drones. One Ukrainian commander compared attacks on fuel convoys traveling the highway to hunting partridge in an open field. Around 650 vehicles remained trapped on the Crimea bridge for hours. Authorities also imposed a limit allowing no more than 100 liters of gasoline to be carried by each vehicle crossing the bridge. Rail travel was affected as well. The commuter journey between Armyansk and Simferopol expanded to 8 hours. The consequences reached Crimea's tourism sector, one of the peninsula's primary economic pillars. Tour operators reported that 80% of June bookings had been canceled. Across social media, Russian users began warning one another. Messages advised travelers planning vacations in Crimea to cancel their tickets and leave before conditions deteriorated further. Meanwhile, Russia continued activating air defenses, deploying mobile fire teams, and reporting that 239 drones had been intercepted. Yet the strikes still landed, and their impact remained visible. The challenge, facing Russian defenses, appeared structural rather than tactical. Ukraine launched hundreds of drones simultaneously from multiple directions. Air defense networks became saturated as operators attempted to track dozens of targets at the same time. Some drones were intercepted, others reached critical infrastructure. Every successful strike increased the vulnerability of future targets. The destruction of air defense assets during those 3 nights created openings in Crimea's protective network that were difficult to restore. One analyst noted that defenses around Kerch had weakened to such a degree that the strike against the oil terminal was able to succeed. Attention also remained focused on the bridge at Kerch, where defensive coverage has reportedly continued to thin. Technology has further complicated the situation. Ukrainian long-range drones operate at low altitude and present only minimal radar signatures. Large systems such as the S-300 and S-400 were originally designed to counter high-altitude aircraft and missile threats. Detecting small drone swarms flying close to the ground presents a greater challenge. Fiber optic-controlled drone variants introduce another difficulty. Because they do not rely on radio signals, electronic warfare systems cannot easily interfere with them. With no signal available, there is nothing to jam. Russian efforts to address this gap have struggled to keep pace. On June 19th, OSINT analysts reported that Russian mobile fire teams had begun escorting fuel tankers across Crimea. Protection was required, but available teams were limited. Air defense resources remain finite, and priority continues to be directed toward the front line. Crimea had long been treated as a secure rear area. The growth of Ukraine's strike capability changed that assumption. Russian forces now face difficult choices. Whether to defend the bridge, the port, the power plant, or gas infrastructure has become an increasingly complex question. Protecting every target simultaneously is not possible. At the same time, strikes are occurring against all of them. According to the narrative presented, these attacks are not isolated actions. They represent the latest stage of a broader strategy aimed at systematically isolating Crimea. The origins of that strategy trace back to the counteroffensive of 2023. During the summer of 2023, Ukrainian armored formations pushed southward in an effort to sever Russia's land bridge, the road and rail connection linking Crimea with the Russian mainland. That operation did not achieve its objective. Extensive minefields, concentrated artillery strikes, and the absence of air superiority halted the advance. By 2026, however, the situation had changed. According to the narrative presented, drones began accomplishing what armored units could not. Analysis by K of Post argued that Ukraine is now making the land bridge increasingly unusable through drone operations rather than physically cutting it apart. Former commander of United States European Forces, General Ben Hodges, outlined the concept in simple terms. First, isolate the peninsula, cut access to Jankoy, destroy the bridge, then create conditions where Russian forces can no longer remain. According to this approach, isolation is progressing across 3 separate domains. At sea, Ukrainian unmanned naval systems have operated around Crimea since 2023. Approximately 30% of the Black Sea Fleet has either been sunk or severely damaged. The remaining vessels were pushed toward Novorossiysk. Traffic through the Kerch Strait remains under continuous threat. Following the strike on Panagia, the final relatively secure maritime route was also affected. On land, the AOV battalion stated that drone operations have allowed it to dominate major highways across southern Ukraine. The land corridor has increasingly become associated with burning fuel convoys. In the air, repeated attacks against air defense assets continue reducing Crimea's protective coverage. Each successful strike creates opportunities for those that follow. The Crimea Bridge has also experienced a gradual decline. In October 2022, a truck bomb caused the collapse of 2 sections of the structure, leading to months of repair work. In July 2023, naval drones inflicted structural damage. During June 2025, underwater explosives were employed. By 2026, heavy vehicle movement across the bridge had been prohibited, while fuel transportation was suspended for security reasons. The bridge remains standing, yet its effective capacity continues to shrink after each attack. When Putin inaugurated the bridge in 2018, it was presented as a permanent symbol linking Crimea to Russia. Today, according to this assessment, every closure has transformed that symbol into a reminder of Russia's growing difficulties in maintaining control of the peninsula. Defense Minister Fedorov summarized the logistics lockdown strategy with a brief statement. The enemy, he said, should not feel secure even at great distance from the front. The emergence of next-generation AI-guided drones has further increased the impact of that concept. In the final stage of engagement, artificial intelligence assumes control of targeting functions and continues tracking objectives, regardless of electronic warfare interference or signal disruption. Crimea's separation is described not as a future objective, but as an ongoing process. According to this view, that process is accelerating. The individual most closely associated with that effort is Ukrainian Unmanned Systems Forces Commander Madyar. He presented what was described not as a prediction, but as an operational objective concerning Crimea. His statement was direct. Crimea will destroy Moscow. According to Madyar, Putin will continue holding the peninsula until the very end because Crimea represents Russia's most valuable wartime achievement. Yet he argued that this attachment has become a strategic trap. Every resource devoted to Crimea is removed from other sectors of the front. Every reconstruction effort weakens another defensive position. With each passing day, the cost of maintaining the peninsula rises, while its strategic value diminishes incrementally. Madyar stated that the previous reality will never return. He also argued that the more resources Russia commits, the greater the eventual consequences will become. Putin once referred to Crimea as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. According to this narrative, that aircraft carrier is now facing a fuel shortage. On the Russian side, early signs of concern have begun appearing. Among Z-bloggers, Madyar's declaration that 5,000 drones per day could be launched beginning on July 1st generated significant alarm. One Z-blogger summarized the situation by claiming that Crimea was being targeted for blockade and that Donetsk was also at risk. According to that assessment, all roads could eventually be blocked from the air. The current stage, he suggested, was a test of the system's response. The reaction extends beyond military concerns and enters the psychological sphere. For the first time, some supporters of the war are openly discussing the possibility that Crimea could be lost. Kremlin propagandist Alexander KZ described the outlook as bleak. Embedded within his comments was a warning directed toward the Kremlin. The existing defensive approach, he implied, was failing to produce results. Military bloggers also criticized the armed forces, arguing that the attacks were not anticipated and that responses arrived too slowly. Criticism is no longer limited to opposition voices. It is increasingly emerging from individuals traditionally aligned with the system itself. Madyar concluded with the same message: Crimea will destroy Moscow. According to this perspective, the psychological breaking point is already developing beneath the surface. He argued that authoritarian systems often collapse suddenly. He also stated that Moscow's position in Crimea is steadily deteriorating. Madyar then addressed Ukrainians living in occupied territories, urging them to remain away from military installations. Those remarks highlighted that the Crimea strategy contains both military and psychological elements. The objective, according to the description provided, is not necessarily the immediate physical capture of the peninsula. Instead, the goal is to create conditions where maintaining control becomes increasingly unbearable for Russia. Even so, the argument that Russia will simply abandon Crimea remains premature. The likelihood of Putin voluntarily giving up the peninsula is described as extremely low. Losing Crimea would represent more than a battlefield setback. It could trigger a political shock with consequences reaching the stability of the regime itself. Russia is aware of those stakes and continues pursuing adaptation measures. New railway connections are under construction across occupied southern Ukraine. Alternative supply routes through Rostov, Mariupol, and Melitopol are being expanded. Air logistics have also been introduced. Aircraft and helicopters are transporting emergency supplies when required. These methods are costly and involve risk, but they remain viable. Russia's ability to repair damaged infrastructure should not be underestimated. The Kerch Bridge remains operational despite 3 major attacks since 2022. Following each incident, traffic eventually resumed. Complete isolation of Crimea has not yet been achieved. Ukraine continues moving forward step by step. Russia, however, is also responding at each stage. Questions also remain regarding Ukraine's ability to sustain such a campaign over time. Every drone strike requires intelligence gathering, preparation, and resources. Launching hundreds of drones over 3 consecutive nights demands a major logistical effort. Those resources could potentially be employed elsewhere along the front. Russia also retains the ability to retaliate. Strikes against Ukraine's energy infrastructure continue. Ukraine's electrical grid remains under pressure as well. The conflict remains active on both sides. Russia continues to possess capabilities it can still employ. As developments continue to unfold, the situation around Crimea remains one of the most closely watched aspects of the broader conflict. If you found this analysis valuable, share your thoughts and stay engaged for future updates on this evolving situation. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.